I was, before we came in here, I was saying that I read that book, Madness at the Gates of the City, sometime last year. And within a matter of weeks, Barry Spector and I were corresponding with each other, and then up came the possibility of him coming here, so it was really good timing. And when I read his book, one of the things that drew me to it was that I couldn't think of any book that I knew of that actually looked at American politics through the lens of mythology. And I thought, wow, it's about time. It's about time we did this. So a little bit about our guest speaker here. So Barry writes about American history and politics from the perspective not only of myth, but also indigenous traditions and archetypal psychology. He has published 3 articles in Young Journal and is the author of that book, Madness at the Gates of the City, and we have other copies of it too for purchase here, which received the Penn Oakland 2011 Josephine Miles Literary Award. And having read it, I can understand why. It's excellent. Barry has taught in the Depth Psychology Master's Program at Sonoma State University and served as guest lecturer at Meridian University, Sophia University, and CIIS. He is taught at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, UC Davis, UC Berkeley, and Cal State, East Bay, and serves on the planning committee of the Redwood Men's Center of Sonoma County, which presents an annual men's conference, and also has coordinated an online discussion group about his book for the Depth Psychology Alliance. In 2013, he wrote the introductory essay for the anthology Uncivil Liberties, Deconstructing Libertarianism by the Praxis Peace Institute, and for over 15 years, he and his wife Maya have performed as part of Rumi's Caravan, what a great name, regular celebrations of recited poetry and music. And rumiscaravan.com is the website for that, by the way. And so with that, please welcome our guest.
Thank you. So I always like to start with a couple of little poems because it's the poetic imagination that is part of what we talk about. First one is from about 700 BC from ancient Greece. It's part of the hymn to Dionysus. It goes like this. Be good to us, you girl-crazy goat. We the poets begin and end our singing with you. And it's impossible without you. Without remembering you, we cannot remember our sacred songs. The second poem is from 1917 or 18, but it refers to a time as old as the first one. It's called The Parable of the Old Man and the Young. And it goes like this. So Abram rose and clave the wood, and took with him fire and a knife. And as they sojourned, both of them together, Isaac, the firstborn, spake and said, Father, behold the preparations, fire and iron. But where is the lamb for this burnt offering? And Abram bound the youth with belts and cords, and builded parapets and trenches there, and stretched forth his knife to slay his son. When lo, an angel called him out of heaven, saying, Lay not thy hand upon the child, neither do anything to him, thy son. Behold, a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. Offer the ram of pride instead. But the old man would not so, but slew his son, and half the seed of Europe, one by one. That's by Wilfred Owen, who may have been one of the great poets of the century, but he was killed a week before the end of the war, and yet another senseless infantry charge into massed machine guns. This was a war in which 7,000 young men died every day for 4 years. And it's interesting, I noticed the timing. 3 days from now, I think the 21st of this month, will be the 100th anniversary of the start of the Battle of Verdun, which lasted 9 months and took 1 million casualties. So we're going to run all around, back and forth, in no particular straight line between mythology and psychology, history, pop culture, and whatever else we can cram in here. Oh, by the way, do we need to stop precisely at 9, or is it, if people are into it, can we just...
Sure, we can keep going, yeah.
Okay, well, we'll see how you feel, you know. So, I'm sure you all have studied myth in this school, and I don't need to say much about it, I don't think. I do know that in one book, one academic, it takes 80 pages to come to a comprehensive definition of myth. To me, I have the privilege of not being an academic, but more to the point, I think it's too important to get bogged down in terminology. To me, myths are very simple. Myths are the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. So they include all of the various categories that the academics want to talk about, and a whole lot more, which would include popular culture and religious sermons, children's literature, the movies especially. We consume our myths in ways, as modern people, that the ancients didn't, but we still have our myths. And as Joseph Campbell spoke a lot about how we live in a demythologized world. And he suggested that the great myth that held Europe together for 1,000 years began to crumble in the 12th century. He refers to the 12th century as the time when the Christian myth began to break down. To me, in my study, it goes much, much further back. If you want to get into this kind of talk, we could go all the way back to the origins of patriarchy. And I think the poem that Wilfred Owen told, or that I told of Wilfred Owen's, it's obviously referring as a metaphor to the sacrifice of the young men on the battlefields of northern France. But he's speaking to a time, he's actually using the mythic image out of old Hebrew myth that goes back at least 3,000 years. And it seems to me that the myth itself of the father being willing to sacrifice his son for a god, for a patriarchal god, is already even 3,000 years ago, is already beginning to talk about how myth itself is breaking down, because it breaks down when we begin to think literally instead of symbolically, instead of nuanced ways, instead of I think we as modern people have lost, to a great extent, the capacity to think metaphorically and symbolically. And I think there's no reason to assume that indigenous people can't and still can think that way. So that's one of the big themes in my book. So when Campbell's talking about a demythologized world, I take that to mean that it's not that we don't have myths anymore, it's just that the myths no longer serve us. And furthermore, that we're, to a great extent, we're very much unconscious of our mythic stories. And that's part of what, a big theme in my book is what we'll talk about. By the way, this doesn't have to be a lecture. If I'm saying, especially if I'm saying with such a small group, if I'm saying something that really pisses you off, let me know, please, and we'll get into that. We can have a good argument here. So, I think of, I don't think I've coined the phrase, I call it the creative imagination. To me, I'm thinking of times and in a few places, still places, where myths really did hold people together and give them meaning, and provide the stories and the rituals that allowed the elders to recognize the innate gifts of young people as they came into the world. So myth really did hold people together in those ways. And so the phrase demythologized world is talking about how our stories no longer provide that kind of meaning for us. As I look at it, over long periods of time, very gradually, what I call the creative imagination has broken down into two parts. What I call the predatory imagination, which is just clearly about the narcissistic desire to conquer and take, and it's just what it sounds like, on the one hand. And on the other hand, what I call the paranoid imagination, which is essentially seeing the world through the prism of fear. And I think anybody that's been paying any attention to any current events over the last 10 years at least, or 20 years, or some of us go a lot further back thinking about that, is I think we know. Well, I think it'll probably ring clear with you when I say that so much of American culture in particular is dominated by fear, and we'll talk a lot more about that. So I find my thinking about the paranoid imagination really can use a little bit more talk. I mean, it's clear what the predatory imagination is. The paranoid imagination combines eternal vigilance, constant anxiety, obsessive voyeurism, creative sadism, contempt for the erotic, and an impenetrable wall of innocence. The paranoid imagination seeks itself, which is to say, and we all share it to some extent, I mean, none of us are free of this, the obsession with images, not just obsession with sin, but images of sin, very detailed images of sin. And I'm only going to read one quote from the book, but since Antonin Scalia is still on our minds, you might find this interesting. To me, it's a one-paragraph description of what we're talking about when we talk about the paranoid imagination. In 1991, the Supreme Court agreed that Indiana could close a private club that advertised nude dancing. I'm sorry, this is the Supreme Court of Indiana. Antonin Scalia at the time wrote the majority opinion, quote, "The purpose of Indiana's nudity law would be violated if 60,000 fully consenting adults crowded into the Hoosier Dome to display their genitals to one another, even if there were not an offended innocent in the crowd," unquote. Think about that. Nobody put that image of 60,000 naked writhing people in the Hoosier Dome into Antonin Scalia's mind. His own imagination produced that image. Would Puritans be so disturbed by naked dancing if the act didn't already exist in their imagination? And I can give you lots more examples of this, but we could take all night just doing that. So, to me, this is what we're facing when we're taking a mythological look at the world, and especially at American culture. I think secular consumer culture under capitalism expresses the predatory imagination pretty clearly, and the paranoid imagination can be seen most clearly in fundamentalist religion, but in many other respects as well. And I think fundamentalist religion has its mirror opposite in consumer culture. So those of us who would first laugh at fundamentalists, of course, your students here, you're well trained to take a step back and consider your own projections, so we don't have to go into that. Is everyone familiar with the stories of Dionysus from Greek myth?
Yes. A little bit.
Sort of.
In general.
Okay, I'm going to take a quick detour through Greek myth because there's so much more we can talk about, but it is the central core of what I talk about, so I want to make sure that we have the images of Dionysus in the room with us. And I invoked him at the very beginning, so he's already with us anyway. But so, in a superficial sense, he's considered the god of wine and of drunkenness. But if looked at a little more deeply, he's the god of ecstasy and communal ecstasy. And the academics for 150 years have been trying to define who this god is, and I think they're all pretty much been projecting their own obsessions on this god. He's the most difficult mythic figure out of the Greek tradition to make any sense of, because he absolutely refuses that. You know about his birth, how Zeus dallied with the nymph Semele, and when Zeus's wife Hera found out, she tricked Semele into asking of Zeus the boon that he would do anything for her, and he, in his passion, agreed, and Semele was tricked into asking Zeus if she could see him in his divine form, not just in his human form that he had come to her as. And he knew, of course, that this meant her death, but he had already promised, and so he couldn't refuse. So Semele was instantly incinerated by lightning. But the child that she had been carrying was still alive, and Zeus took the child and inserted it into his own thigh, and that's how the baby Dionysus was born. He emerged with, in some tales, with horns coming out of his forehead and snakes around his neck, and he was totally mad. To me, the essential. I mean, anybody that gets into this kind of work finds myths that speak to them most strongly. To me, it's the various myths of Dionysus, but especially the Greek tragedy by Euripides called the Bacchae. And I'll just tell you the theme very quickly, because I do want to move on, but I want to make sure we have this image here. Dionysus travels the world with his retinue of half man, half animal satyrs. They're all drunk, and a wild celebrating group of crazed women called the Bacchantes. And he arrives at the city of Thebes, where his mother had died, and Dionysus is in disguise. He's disguised as one of his own priests, and over the course of the play, he has this ongoing confrontation with the young, macho, rigid, moralistic, puritanical king Pentheus, who is actually his own cousin, and they're the same age. So some people think that it's easy to see them as mirror opposites, and we could certainly do that. Anyways, Pentheus refuses to accept this new god, despite all these signs of magic all around him, and he claps Dionysus and his followers into jail. Dionysus just as simply and quickly just emerges from the jail, escapes through magic, and causes a great earthquake to destroy the great towers of the city of Thebes. And a little detour here, when I saw the Twin Towers on 9/11 coming down, I'll say, proviso here, this is not about me, but I knew I could for my writing, this was the central image and metaphor of a story that's 3,000 years old, and yet here it was happening, if you can see the connections here in modern culture. So that's halfway through the play. Pentheus remains rigidly obsessed with repressing Dionysus, despite all the signs of magic. Eventually, there's a part I forgot to tell you. There's another group of Thebes is empty of all of its women. They've all been driven mad by Dionysus, and they're all up on the mountain celebrating these wild rituals, led by Pentheus' own mother. Ultimately, Dionysus provokes Pentheus' hidden voyeurism that lies just below his own puritanical judgments, and brings Pentheus up to the mountains where the women in their madness mistake the king for a lion cub, and in probably the most horrendous scene in all of Greek tragedy, tear him limb from limb and destroy him utterly, led by his own mother. So this is the power of Dionysus, of a repressed force. When it is repressed too long, ultimately causes or explodes or causes an explosion to set things right. And I think we can also take another step back and see this is, or consider this maybe the way the soul grows, the human soul. We search for what the hidden, repressed parts of ourselves, and the only way we can do that is by putting the image out there, away from us, projecting it out and demonizing it. And some of us are lucky enough to eventually come to some sense of knowledge of ourselves, and the realization that thing out there that we've been demonizing for so long is in fact ourselves. So Dionysus is also called Lucios, or the Luciner. The Greek root is the root for the word analyst, or catalyst. So it's something that when it is brought into the equation, expands the whole thing, loosens things up. And of course the connection to alcohol is pretty clear as well. So
is that also connected to Lucifer?
no.
Okay.
Well, actually,
If you look at the
Lucifer is light too, and actually it's very possible that the word itself, Lucifer, the etymology may be from the Greek, in which case you would be exactly correct there. I've never actually looked that one up, and I'll have to. But obviously it's, well, Lucifer, you know, in some of the stories is pretty much the mirror image of Jehovah. So there's a connection there on the metaphorical level as well. But that's a good question. I'll have to check that one out. So to me, I'm no expert on these things, but I think we're talking about a mythic image that was common in Greece 1,000 years BC, and probably much, much earlier than that, and has been worked and reworked for another 2,000 years. There's a production of the Bacchae somewhere in this country every week. I mean, it's still an extremely provocative theme. So to me, I think the image of Dionysus expresses an archetype, which I'm calling the other, the archetype of the other, which is that part of ourselves that is so deeply, essentially who we are, and yet for some reason or other, usually by social norms or personal, we can't accept, and so we project out onto the world somewhere and demonize. So, and this is how the soul comes to know itself. So, I've given a lot of thought to this notion of the other, and since it is the essential theme, as I see it, of American history and contemporary politics, I'll say a few more things about the other. So, innocence defines itself in terms of the other. Splitting off aspects of ourselves, we know who we are because we are not them. By the way, for the rest of this conversation, and I hope it's a conversation, whenever I use the word we, it's got very large quotes around it. What it actually is referring to is white, patriarchal, American, dominant culture. Mm-hmm. But I'll just use the word we with quotes around it. So we know who we are because we are not them. I think in some cultures, in some indigenous cultures, it wasn't always that way. I think identity was actually more of a positive thing. We are who we are because of who we are, not because we're not them. But I think it's an aspect of the demythologized world, the falling apart of mythic and ritual structures that most people in the modern world, if we define our sense of who we are to a great extent in terms of who we are not. Men certainly spend a lot of time defining themselves as not women, for example, rather than in a positive manner. So the primary categories of and I'll use othering as a verb of our race, class, and gender. So Americans in particular, and we'll get into this, because of our profoundly influential Puritan heritage, have always seen the other as those like Dionysus, whom we have labeled as being unable to control their own impulses. Now, going back to Greek myth, Dionysus has no boundaries. He's pure biology. He does what he wants. He says what he wants. He sleeps with who he wants. He has no sense of control from the perspective of his mirror opposite, which would be Apollo. Yeah. So it's our Puritan heritage that has enabled us to project this notion of inability to control our own impulses. So men have projected this notion onto women. White Americans have projected it, of course, onto black people and Native Americans. So this is the essence of othering in America. So otherness inspires fear of pollution, but it also fascinates us. Racists and homophobes, such as Scalia, are deeply irrationally dependent upon the objects of their own prejudice. They are unable to rid the mind of obsessions with the other. And as I said, such intense and detailed fantasies reveal a soul, or I would stretch this further, a nation actually attempting to know itself. Indeed, our innate wholeness always threatens to return. Psychologically speaking, what is repressed never disappears. Mythologically speaking, all residents of the underworld await their return to the surface world. So othering is inconsistent. Bigots see black people as both lazy and threatening. Now think about that for a second. To hold those two almost opposite judgments about people as part of one prejudice. Richard Nixon famously warned in a speech, quote, of the forces of totalitarianism and anarchy, unquote. Think about it. in one phrase, he managed to include the entire spectrum of political prejudice. But when scapegoating is the intention, any demonizing narrative will do. It doesn't have to be consistent, or certainly it doesn't have to be rational. So in my thinking about the other, it struck me over time that what we do is we unconsciously, one of the things we do is we unconsciously split the other into the inner other and the outer other. We fear barbarism coming from the outside and decadence within. And we'll get into this more in the second half, but we can look at, say, for example, European history, where for hundreds of years there was an internal other, the Jew, and there was an external other, the Muslim. And I think that kind of thinking was part of the puritanical thinking that came to America, and very quickly, especially in the North, where the Puritans were in control, this kind of projection went on onto the Native Americans, who by all counts, were not wildly out of control sexually or in any other way, but the beginning and evolving myth of America had to deal with an enormous contradiction, that they were essentially stealing someone else's land. And so they began to tell a story in which the only way to make sense of it all was to see, either to see those other people who were already there as not human being at all, or as not deserving. And so it was a simple matter for Europeans in those early generations to project all of this kind of stuff on the Native Americans, even before black people were brought in as slaves. So, any questions at this point?
Was there anybody in Europe, in the unconscious of these people that were doing this to the native people when they came here?
I'm sorry?
Was there any memory in the, like an unconscious memory that, I mean, they came from Europe, right?
Yeah.
So didn't they see indigenous people in Europe, counterpart native people, that they had interactions with? I'm wondering. So was were they prepared to dishonor them by their experience in Europe?
I think so. I mean,
Yeah.
I think Europe had at that point it had, 1,500 years of the Christian myth, an obsession with the devil, and as I said, several hundred years of confrontation with Islam. I mean, Spain was Islamic for 600 years, and in 1492, when the first Spanish approached this land, it was exactly the same year that they finally expelled, first expelled the Jews, and had just conquered the Muslims finally after 700 years of conflict. So anyways, it's a long, involved historical discussion, and I regretfully can only make passing reference to it right now. But yeah, I mean, the European mind had who knows how many hundreds, if not thousands of years of the breakdown between between mind and body, between soul and spirit, and the more the European consciousness had been driven to be split apart, the more there was this need to see the part that had been split off.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, there had been hundreds of years of
Dark and light too. Dark and light.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely, of course, yeah.
Yeah.
So I'll plunge on a little further here. We'll be talking about the inner. It's a mouthful. I have to say it slowly. The inner other and the outer other, because I think it really does. Once we start thinking in these terms, we can begin to see a lot of American history and politics coming into focus over time. So, to me, both the paranoid and the predatory imaginations depend on othering. Either we locate paradise within to be protected from that other out there, or it is elsewhere, an empty space, the female body, or the American wilderness that's ripe for exploitation. There were all kinds of stunning quotes from the early explorers and philosophers of this time, in which they are quite literally comparing the so-called empty American wilderness, empty because those savages out there weren't really people, comparing the empty American wilderness to the female body, ripe for exploitation. So this was very very clear in some of their writings. And so, yeah, I don't think there's any more fundamental divide between the indigenous tribal world and the modern world than in this approach to the other. And it's very interesting to find a few etymological and language remnants of another world that thought very differently. It's not that indigenous people didn't also imagine the other. It's that it's possible, at least my imagination at least, is that they didn't demonize the other automatically. One of the words used to describe Dionysus in many of the Greek tragedies is xenos, X-E-N-O-S. And you'll probably recognize that as the root of xenophobia. And now here's the interesting part. Xenos means stranger. However, it also means guest. And it depends entirely on the context in which it's spoken. So, to me, and that's just one little tiny bit of etymology, old remnant of etymology, but to me it opens up a huge imagination about how it could have been, how it was, maybe it is in some places, and how it could be in the future. You can go now in modern Greece, and you can go stay at hotels that are named Philos Genea, love of the stranger, or love of the guest. And in that case it's obviously guest, but it's the same word. And in the indigenous world, people have to make sense of who those people are on the other side of the mountain who speak a different language. If they're going to be trading with them, or if they're not going to be in constant warfare with them, they have to make sense of who they are. And so they evolved all kinds of ways of seeing the other as something that, rather than being a threat to us, might very well be what we need to complete who we are. And again, this is all much of it is my imagination. I'll be the first to admit that. But that's exactly what we need, is a new imagination. So I figure we'll probably take a break at the top of the hour. So I'm going to lurch on with some more concepts here. Actually, we're doing pretty well by time here. Any other questions at this point? Okay, so let's say a few things about Joseph Campbell, which you may be familiar with, but again, it's kind of essential to what we're talking about. Two things I want to say from Campbell's teaching. One is he speaks about the four functions of mythology. You have the mystic function that connects, in which the stories connect people to the great mysteries of the world and of nature and of the other world. You have the cosmological function that explains how the world came to be and how it fits in with other worlds. You have the what is it called? What's that third one?
Sociological.
Yeah, I'll call that the fourth one. It's the teaching function. Pedagogical, in which young people are taught through the stories about how it is to be an ethical, functioning person within a given culture. The fourth, and this is where Campbell is talking about the demythologized world. He says, pretty much in the modern world, all we have is the fourth one. It's at the sociological level that essentially connects the individual life to the authority of the social group, or in modern terms, to the state. And so when we're talking about how myths function in the modern world, we're mostly talking about the sociological function, according to Campbell. The other thing that's really critical to our whole conversation that comes out of Campbell is his original insights into the notion of the three-part heroic journey. Are you all familiar with that? Start from someplace, you enter a place of the known, you enter the place of the unknown, where you have trials, and you return.
Mm-hmm.
And you probably know that this three-part hero's journey exactly replicates the three-part journey of the initiation rituals from the indigenous world. And the young man, usually it's stories of men because they're communal stories. Young men, they're taken out of the known world, connected to the village and the feminine world. They're brought by the older men into the trials, the actual initiatory trials. And then the return. And and in our context, the return is absolutely, well, all parts of it are critical, but the return is at least as important as the other parts of the journey. The return by the new initiate to the community with his boon, the gift that he comes back with, that he gives to the community. At which point the community is now accepting and welcoming him back as a full-fledged adult member of the community. And that brings up all kinds of issues of individuality versus individualism. That in this imagination, every single member of the culture is valued because everyone has some absolutely unique gift to give. And the initiation process is what brings that gift out. It's perceived and seen by the older men, and then the young men come back into the culture with it. So that's your three-part initiation model that is an exact replica in ritual terms of Campbell's hero's journey. So, this is all background, and I apologize for racing so quickly through so much of this, but this is background, mythological and psychological thinking that we can begin to look at what I call the myth of American innocence. So. Ask a few questions about that.
I'll ask you a question.
Sure.
So the rites you just discussed, would you say they relate to similarities in the mystery schools also, in some of their initiation rites, if you know of anything about that?
Well, I'm not an expert in that matter, but it would appear that the three-part format of ritual of deep ritual is probably universal.
Yeah, I mean, I suspected so. I was just curious if you knew, if you could expand on that, but on the mystery school aspect of it. And I also was wondering about how the archetypes fit in to each step along the way, if at all.
What do you mean?
Well, there's 3 parts, you said, and so they go through various phases, so I was wondering if they're ruled by certain archetypal energies.
Good question. Well, in the Greek tradition, probably the god Hermes is the one who presides over such transitions, because that's his world. You could take another perspective and say that, or imagine that each of us comes in with our own original medicine, and part of what the initiation process may well be doing is getting us more consciously connected with one of those archetypal images. So some might very well come be initiated as warriors, and would in that tradition might have come to be followers of Ares or of Athena, or of, so. But those are images that express archetypes. The images themselves are not archetypes. You want to add anything here?
What, your mystery school question? I immediately thought of Aloysius, the Eleusinian mysteries, and how they proceed, and that's, as far as we know. There's a departure phase where everybody goes into the underground complex, and then there's some sort of a huge revelation while people are down there, and then they come out afterwards and return to their ordinary business without telling anybody what happened, however.
Right, yeah,
So,
yeah. It also comes to mind even Egyptian rites too, and the idea of death and rebirth, and some people just didn't come out of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Just didn't come out of it.
That's an expression of how profoundly important the transition is. I think, well, again, let's go back to that poem that I told at the very beginning, where the father is quite literally sacrificing the son. It's no metaphor in that poem. He's doing it. And for 3,000 years, Jews and Christians and Muslims have been debating about this whole thing. But in the story itself, it's very clear. Now, in the Hebrew tradition, Abraham backs off at the last second, of course. But to me, the real issue is that he was willing to do it. In other traditions, I understand, and there are lots of books on this issue. It's called the Akedah, the sacrifice of Isaac. In some of the traditions, Abraham literally does go through with it and does sacrifice the son. But to me, the important thing is that he was willing to do so. And to me, what that is saying, now that we're talking about initiation, we can go back to this image here, this myth. We're talking about history. We're not talking about mythology anymore. We're talking about history, where people for a very long time in Europe now, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, have not been able to think, as I said, symbolically anymore. And that poem, the poem about World War I is bewailing the poet's notion that the elders, the fathers, no longer have any memory of what it's like to actually bring their sons through a symbolic kind of initiation. They can only do it literally. They can only do it by quite literally sending their sons out to be mowed down by machine guns. And that could, to me, that's a description of the entire 20th century. But I must plunge on. So we're gonna leap. I'll throw out a couple of questions here, and then I need to go to the bathroom. I don't know what you feel. We'll take 5 minutes. So I'm thinking about going directly into this notion of what I mean when I'm talking about the myth of American innocence and its origins. So I threw out this question at some place in my book. What an ambiguous and conflicted mix of crusading moralism, anxious consumerism, cutthroat competition, aggressive practicality, racist brutality, apocalyptic fear, arrogant optimism, cheerful naivete, willful ignorance, celebrity worship, and generous goodwill and rollicking bad taste constitutes our public lives. The myth of innocence holds it all together. And to understand the sociological power of our myth, consider some questions. Why do millions of Americans who support unions, environmental protection, progressive taxation, women's equality, and universal health care continue to vote Republican? Or still believe that Saddam Hussein caused 9/11? Why, with 12,000 nuclear warheads, do we demonize nations that develop their own? Now, I'm not arguing a particular political point of view here. I'm trying to throw these kinds of questions out to provoke us to be thinking mythologically. I mean, I don't want to convince you of any particular political agenda, but I do want you to come out of this time together looking at our lives and the news and our political lives with a little bit more of a perspective that mythology offers. So I may have to say this more than once tonight. I'm not trying to convince you of any political perspective. It's the questions that are interesting. Why do most of us assume, quite wrongly, that well-educated Americans are more anti-war than less educated people? Why does the American flag appear in front of every public school, at every university commencement speech, at the New York Stock Exchange, auto dealerships, mortuaries, and churches? Why do both civil rights activists and the Ku Klux Klan carry the American flag? Why do we sing the national anthem before ball games? These are mythological questions. They're not political questions. In totalitarian societies, as I see it, the dictator's version of reality must be obeyed. Americans, however, believe the myths underlying our fascination with innocence more than other cultures have ever done. When nearly everyone shares the common mythic language of Americanism, vigorous argument is encouraged, but only within the limits imposed by unstated doctrinal orthodoxy. This is Noam Chomsky's essential insight into American politics. Okay, I've been yakking. I need to take a break just to get into the bathroom and back. All right, I'll start our second half with another poem from Rumi. I have been living on the lip of insanity, wanting to know reasons. Knocking on a door. It opens. I've been knocking from the inside. So, I'll start with, so in the second half we're going to try to make some attempt to use these basic insights about mythology and psychology in looking at history and popular culture. But let me begin by defining exactly what I mean by the myth of American innocence. Again, myths are stories. They're for most of our history, they were simply told orally around campfires at night. But they're the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. And as I see it, the myth of innocence is a 400-year series of narratives which include novels, songs, Boy Scout creeds, children's stories, political rhetoric, sermons, advertisements, films, television, everything that we tell ourselves about ourselves, that justify American capitalism. Oh! The Myth of American Innocence. A series of narratives that justify American capitalism, racism, imperialism, and environmental destruction by blaming its victims. This is the critical thing to get across here. Blaming its victims, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute, but just to add at this point, blaming the victim is a core aspect of our theology. It comes directly out of the Puritan ethic. By blaming its victims and removing all guilt and responsibility from both its perpetrators and its beneficiaries. So, one of the common questions I get is, oh, well, there have been empires everywhere, they've all done this, they've all claimed that they're doing good for the world and so on and so on. But as far as I've been able to figure it out, one of the things that makes American mythology so unique is this emphasis on the blaming of the victim for his or her own fate. And that's, again, it's a mirror opposite experience of our essential, of our obsession with heroic behavior and winning. You could almost quote Donald Trump right now: if you're not a winner, you're a loser. There is nothing in between. He is right there in as succinct a manner as possible, has brought he brought my whole book, 400 pages, down to one phrase: you're a winner or you're a loser. Now, other mythologies are much more nuanced. They have all kinds of ranges of imagery that don't so dualistically divide the world that way. So these stories describe a people who built a nation out of the wilderness and brought freedom and equal opportunity to the world. America is the divinely inspired savior among other nations. But our story has a huge shadow. Both the systematic deprivation of large numbers of our own population, as well as massive violence perpetrated against the third world. So, according to some writers, one of the purposes of myth, and certainly the sociological level of myth, is to help us live with massive contradictions. In America, for 400 years, we have been making sense of our contradictions by repeatedly telling ourselves stories of our own innocence. As I said earlier, when the first settlers began to steal the land from the Native Americans, this is the dynamics, the internal psychological dynamics that were happening in every, probably every man involved in the early generations of the conquest. And within a surprisingly short time, this dynamic became the essence of the stories that we told ourselves about ourselves. And I'll get into that in a minute. But the myth is inherently unstable because it teeters on these contradictions. So periodically, when our national story shows great tears in its fabric, holes in the story, so to speak, the elite and their intellectual apologists go to great lengths to shore up the myth, as in the current war on terror. This is the systematic manufacture of consent, not content, consent, and identity based upon terror of the other. Here we are back to, how do we know each other? We know who we are, and as I said, that we has a great big quotes around it, because we are not the other. And this, we brought this heritage with us, and America, over time, white Americans began to, as I see it, project out into the world this notion of the inner other and the outer other. The first thing they saw was the outer other, that they had to, in order to make sense of their own behavior, they had to start telling these stories of dark-skinned savages descending upon the good, innocent white people out of the dark forests for no reason whatsoever, out of pure hatred and evil. Sound familiar? I mean, I hope we don't have to draw parallels to the current situation. But well, my point is, our fear, Islamophobia, fear of immigrants, fear of black people in the inner cities. This is not new. This is only the current iteration of a story that's been going on since the very beginning of the European conquest of this continent. The outer other was attacking the community from without, and soon enough, in just a few generations, history provided white people with the inner other as well, which was the African American, who, because slavery was such an absolutely critical, foundational, unavoidable aspect of all of the affluence that grew out of this culture. The black people had to be kept within the city, so to speak, on the plantations, whereas the red men were out there in the wilderness. So the American mythology and the growing American psyche sort of teased out the inner other and the outer other. Now the outer other, of course, is Islamic terrorism and immigrants, and we still hold to for our inner other to the one image that we've kept all the way through, which is the African Americans who are the inner other. Yeah.
You know, I noticed too that we kind of romanticize the Native Americans at the same time and I started to see a lot of romanticizing of black with the presidential election. I think a lot of people romanticize the shadow in a way. So can you say something about that split?
Well, early on there was a lot of conflict between the two projections onto the natives. There were people who quite literally didn't believe that they were human, and there were other people who felt that they were the last innocent good souls. And aspects of that particular split have come through our literature for hundreds of years. But for the most part, it's the hatred, the demonizing projection that held sway for the longest time. And I'll get into some of the historical aspects of that in just a minute. But before we go there, I'll just ask another question. What makes America unique in this regard? The answer, as I see it, is that no other nation has gone to such lengths to define itself by excluding so many from full membership, including rigid legal systems deliberately intended to divide natural allies, while simultaneously telling itself pervasive stories of freedom and opportunity. With the possible exception of South Africa, I think the United States is the only society to so confuse class and race with each other. Howard Zinn said, there is not a country in world history in which racism has been more important for so long. Cornel West has said, no other democratic nation revels so blatantly in such self-deceptive innocence, such self-paralyzing reluctance to confront the night side of its own history. And I would add, only Americans justify invasion and genocide with stories of idealism, good intentions, and the theory of manifest destiny, that we are a people. Oddly enough, it's a curious thing. Part of the theology of Puritanism was this emphasis on extreme radical individualism, that we all had our own relationship with the divine, and so we became a nation of individualists. The curious thing is that as we solidified into a nation, the evolving mythology began to portray the nation itself as an individual among nations. And part of that story was that the nation had a divine guidance. Manifest destiny was the term that first was used in the 1830s, that God had actually meant for this nation to go out and spread the good word of democracy and freedom to all other nations, whether they asked for it or not. So,
So it's like that implies a delusion,
Yeah,
that this
Yeah.
country has a delusional aspect to our belief in who we are in the world.
that's a perfectly good phrase to use. I mean, I think of it, to me, that particular phrase is not as helpful. Because I'm always trying to see in terms of story, what we're doing, who we are, how we define ourselves. We tell ourselves a story. And ultimately, that story may be leading us where we need to go. So, yeah, of course we're deluded. Of course, at that level. But I'm trying to expand the whole conversation to another perspective. But you're absolutely right. So I suggest that the myth is subscribed to in deep unconscious ways by almost all white Americans, liberals no less than conservatives. And we could start a big fight about that too, if we have time. So, back to Joseph Campbell. The three-part initiation heroic journey. You start in the known, you're drawn into the world of the trials, and you return with your new wisdom, often symbolized by something you found in the other world, you know, the golden ring or the beautiful maiden that the hero brings back. So the hero is returning, 1, 2, 3. That, as you probably know, Campbell referred to as the monomyth. He saw it everywhere in all of world culture, except in modern culture. And so I started thinking about what that meant in terms of America, which I see as modern culture writ large. So much of modern culture is American pop culture anyway. So much of the imagery you find in movies all across the world is American imagery, and it's been that way for 100 years. So it's really America that we're talking about. Except in America, I said. In America, the myth evolved something completely different and yet tantalizingly similar. In the story that was beginning to evolve, and I'm talking by 1650, certainly solidified by 1700, and then 300 more years of telling of the story. A very slightly, a different take, but fundamentally different and critical difference. In the American story, it goes like this. You have an innocent community, absolutely pure innocent, often symbolized by a young, beautiful blonde woman, in which, and the innocent community is attacked, as I said, and referring to the Native Americans, is attacked from the outside. And the story is told thousands upon thousands of times over these 400 years. At the last second, a hero arrives from somewhere else. He is not part of the community. And he dispatches the evil other with biblical fury. I mean, really unnecessary violence. And restores innocence to the community, at which point the hero generally leaves. So do you see the difference here from the world monomythic story that Joseph Campbell saw everywhere except in modern culture? and again, it's American culture that's the essence of it all. The hero comes from somewhere else, enters the community only to defeat evil, and then leaves. So it's, again, it's a three-part sequence, but it's a fundamentally different three parts. The hero, neither the hero nor the community grow in experience. He doesn't give any boon to the community of wisdom or insight. He simply kicks ass and saves them, and then rides off into the sunset. There have been, now these stories have been told, like as I said, thousands upon thousands of times, and throughout the 20th century they were told in the movies. And the essential, absolutely essential, perfect, clear, pristine expression of that is from 1953 or 4, the movie Shame. And does anybody recall that movie? It's the story I'm just telling you. And at the end of the movie, Shane, the hero, who has killed all of the bad guys and is obviously in love with a woman in the community, gets up on his horse and leaves and rides into the sunset, into the west, or as in Native American lore, into the world of death, but away from this world. He has a choice to stay in the world and settle down among the other innocents, or leave and go off to other pursuits and other conquests. And that story is told thousands upon thousands of times in American mythology. It's also important to note, just in passing quickly, America, if we're talking about the period roughly 1500 to 1650, the creation of this idea of America, even long before it becomes a nation, but the idea of America is already a solid part of the European consciousness by 1550. That America is born along with colonialism, Protestantism, capitalism, radical individualism, and the witch craze in Europe. The witch craze, a lot of people think the witch craze happened in medieval Europe. It didn't. I mean, there were individual attacks on women as witches, but the witch craze itself was occurring at exactly the same time, when Europeans were obsessed with evil and projecting it upon for the most part, women, but also Jews. There were tremendous massacres of the Jews in this time. But so all of this is happening. America, the idea of America is beginning to grow in world history, just as all of these other massive transitions in history are also occurring. You got a question, or you just? Okay. So, another quote from one of I meant to throw this one earlier, but I just noticed it. Jerry Falwell, who was at the time probably one of America's 2 or 3 best known religious figures, quite literally said in a direct quote, "This is America. If you're not a winner, it's your own fault." So I have to get back to that before I move on. Now, what Puritanism's primary influence on the American psyche came out of Calvinism, and from Calvinism they brought this notion of predestination with them as they came across the ocean. And by the way, a related question or a related thought is that England in particular was able to, over a period of time, get rid of almost all of its worst religious fanatics by sending them here. And that's a joke, but it's the essence of American history. I've read that throughout the 17th century and well into the 18th century, 100% of America's intellectuals were Puritans. And so for 5, 6 generations at least, it was their thinking and their writings that set the tone for theology and the stories that we were telling, beginning to tell ourselves about ourselves. So in this notion of predestination, you have this bizarre and yet, well, crazily familiar notion that at the very beginning of time, the Creator had just determined who was to be saved, even if they weren't going to be born for thousands of years, and who was damned, and that none of us could do a thing about it. This is the notion of predestination. So the Puritans began to see their own success as an expression of that notion of predestination. And the mirror opposite of that thinking was that if you were not a success, it was because you had been among the vast majority who from the very beginning of time were among the damned. And so even though at a superficial level the American mythology was speaking about opportunity and freedom and the ability to make of yourself anything that you wanted to make of yourself, and that remains superficially our sense of what makes Americans different from other people. I mean, it's the whole thing behind the American dream. But just below that, for several hundred years, we have been carrying unconsciously, I think, to a great extent, except for people like Trump and Falwell, who had no censors between head and mouth, and would just come out and say it. You know, if you're not a winner, you're a loser. We have been carrying unconsciously this notion that our own misery is our own fault. And part of what that implies is that there's no point organizing politically. You know, it has very significant political ramifications, this way of thinking. But I'm suggesting that we can find all kinds of evidence throughout American history and right up to the present where that kind of thinking has absolutely dominated our notions not only of who we are, but especially of who other people are. So that America was, well, James Baldwin described Ronald Reagan as having, I remember this phrase, it struck me, brutal contempt for the poor. Now that Reagan may have carried that as an extreme expression of a political mentality, but he was simply expressing American mythology. One of the things about mythology is that we have these divine figures who are the inhabitants of these great stories, and I think there's plenty of evidence that indigenous people understood that these figures, these great figures that were inhabiting the great stories, were also expressing parts of themselves, and that they could potentially access their own nobility, and that's part of what's been lost in this demythologized world. What we have instead is politicians and the culture of celebrity, in which these, well, from our perspective, deluded and deluding figures that we may find either compelling or very easy to make fun of, but because we've lost to a great extent that ability to think mythologically and think in metaphorical terms, we don't realize that they're actually enacting our own story, and we can see that in a positive or a negative light depending on whether we're thinking of celebrities or hated politicians or whatever. But modern people have lost to a great extent this ability to see that the great figures who inhabit our stories now are inhabiting our own psyches. We don't see that anymore. I think indigenous people always knew that. Anyways.
Can I ask you something just to tie that in?
Yeah.
So that the monomyth, the hero, disappears. So there's no learning.
No.
There's no boon, there's no learning, there's no one to model off.
If he does one thing, it's to restore innocence.
Say again?
To restore innocence.
But it's not innocence, it's almost like a dumbness.
Well, you
It's
could- well,
stupidity.
if you
rather than
prefer,
innocence.
you know, again, you could say,
Yeah,
well,
staying.
what's the old question? What's the difference between, how does it go, ignorance and apathy? The answer is, I don't know and I don't care.
Okay.
I mean, yeah,
I'm free. Yeah.
yeah. So, yeah, the essential thing is, in the old stories, the hero returns and brings with him experience. And the great distinction is between ignorance and experience, or innocence and experience. In the new story, that distinction.
There's no second naivete possible. It's like you're a child that never wakes up. That if you're innocent,
Yeah.
you don't go through the initiation, and an adult.
In both meanings of the term innocent, which is to say, on one definition would be lacking experience,
Yeah.
childlike. The other one being not guilty.
Mhm.
So, I have a quote somewhere in the book. Some of the major Nazis at the Nuremberg trials, one of the commandant of Auschwitz said, "I killed 5 million people innocently.
Mhm.
I didn't realize it." You know.
Can I ask you one other thing that keeps coming up for me is innocent until proven guilty. And I thought that's very interesting, you know, and I just saw a film about war made, I think in Sweden. They're showing the guy kills someone, orders
Oh, the Michael Moore movie.
not the Michael Moore one, no, this is a film festival one in subtitle about a Swedish battalion in Afghanistan. The idea there was he's guilty, but someone lies for him, so he's innocent again. You know, but he knows he's guilty, but he's relieved of the real guilt because the whole idea is a lie.
Yeah. Well, it doesn't take a lot of psychological nuance to imagine that the soul at some level knows
Yeah.
everything that we're talking about, but is going to elaborate lengths to deny it. And yet, you know, again, I mean, this is archetypal psychology at its, you know, at its simplest. This is how the soul comes to know itself, potentially by gradually pulling those projections back in and painfully coming to the realization that what I was demonizing out there is part of who I am. But that is the road to healing. And that is, I think that is the road to national healing as well. Again, I'm going to plunge on a little more into history to give you a clearer sense of what we're talking about. I have found a critical period of American history, roughly the 20 years between 1675 and 1695. I'll spend a little time on here so as to root us more into how the story came, how we came to tell these stories. So there were roughly 5 big things going on in that 20-year period. King Philip's War was an ongoing war between the New England settlers and the Indians of New England. It lasted a couple of years, and it was so vicious that 1/10 of the white population was killed. Of course, a much higher percentage of the natives were killed, but the point is, throughout the eastern seaboard and into the areas where the settlers were moving westward, there was at this time, and for quite a while afterwards, a perpetual, day-to-day, massive fear and growing hatred of the Native Americans. So this is just part of the background to what's going on in these 20 years. Second thing I'll mention is around 1675, the first captivity narrative is published. Are you familiar with that? It's a story in which a white woman who had been kidnapped or stolen or been one of the captive survivors had been taken to live among the natives and either escaped on her own or some hero came and saved her and brought her back. So this is to students of American literature, captivity narratives are a huge theme, and so huge in fact that as I've read, for the next 50 years, with the exception of the Bible, every single best-selling book in America was a captivity narrative. Every single one. Which takes us into the 18th century. Well, my book provides countless examples of how this story was retold constantly throughout the 19th century, and once the movies came in, throughout the 20th century. This is the essential American story, in which our whole sense of who we are is condensed down into a very simple theme. Innocence is in peril. The hero comes and saves innocence. If I had more time, I could give you countless examples. But it's very clear that these captivity narratives were the essential American story. In fact, they were pretty much the only American story for several generations. So much so that it became part of the American soul psyche itself, that this is how white Americans came to conceive of who they were in terms of this outer other who was constantly threatening. And as you know, the wars of the Native Americans extended until the last decade of the 19th century. At which point the other took on other features, but I'll get to that in a second. So we have King Philip's War, we have constant warfare, we have captivity narratives. 1692-93 we have the Salem witch trials, in which the community becomes absolutely crazy, deluded. I'm getting to like that word. Obsessed with the other. Now the other is part of the community, and anybody could have named names, and suddenly the wrath of the whole community fell upon that person, and some, I don't know, 40 or 50 people were killed, almost all of them women, before the craze ended. And that was only the first of many witch crazes in American history. It's the only one that's called a witch craze, but in 1918 we had what's called the Red Scare. In the early 50s we had McCarthyism, and of course now we have the War on Terror. This is again an ongoing theme in American history in which the paranoid imagination is whipped up to a frenzy, in this case over the inner other. But always the outer other is out there lurking as well. So, and then 1676 or 86 or something like that, had a very curious thing called Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia. And it's the only time in our history when, and there's a great big background behind this that I don't have time to get into. Indentured servants, white and black, united to attack the colonial rulers of Virginia, and they very nearly won. Eventually they were all killed, but the notion, and this is before, I'm mentioning this because it's so critical. This is before people spoke in terms of white and black. It was really just a question of free men versus servants, or generally indentured servants. Some people were considered slaves, but generally it was the distinction that people made in America. Not talking about the Indians, just talking about those of us who were within the pale, so to speak. The distinction was between free and enslaved or servant. After Bacon's Rebellion, the elites of Virginia and other places in the South were so horrified at the potential that all of the black and white and red servants might unite again, that they began to institute vast changes in the legal system so as to distinguish between white and black. And even free black men lost their rights in many cases, and very significantly, blacks who were still enslaved were to be enslaved forever, and their children were to be enslaved. And there were all kinds of other distinctions that were made so that poor white men who had nothing to distinguish themselves from poor blacks were suddenly given rights that the poor blacks could no longer have. And they became essentially a buffer zone, a buffer population between the planters and the slaves. And all they had to distinguish themselves from black people was the beginnings of what we now know of as white privilege. And fast forward 150 years or so, the question, students of the American Civil War still wrestle with the question, why did several 100,000 absolutely impoverished, dirt poor white men go off to fight and sacrifice themselves for a political and economic system that did not serve them? And the only answer I can come up with in terms of mythological thinking is what they were fighting for was white privilege. They weren't fighting for the South in terms of an economic system. They were fighting for their own white privilege, which they had had for 100 years at that point. So that's why Bacon's Rebellion is so significant at this point, because it marks the time at which America begins to distinguish between white and black. And when I thought of it, I realized, well, we have this whole notion of the red, white, and blue. In fact, our mythology and our history at this point had divided very clearly into the red, the white, and the black. The white were the good, innocent community. The black were the others who were kept within the community, and the red were those still threatening from the outside of the community. Fast forwarding to roughly 1675, I mentioned that the Indian Wars went on for another 15 years or so, but roughly around the time of Custer's last stand, which is 1876, more or less within a couple of years marks the end of the major confrontations between the U.S. Army and the Indians. Right about that time is when a word enters the American language, communism. That's the first time where you see the word, the specter of the red communists. Just as the red outer other is beginning to recede as a danger, it's as if our psyche, our national psyche, needed to find another red other. And we found it almost precisely at the same moment as the natives were being no longer perceived as a threat. So for another, as you know, for another 115 years or so, America was obsessed with another outer red other of communism until roughly 1990. And the last thing that I would mention of this period between 1675 and 1695, back to the Puritans, Cotton Mather, son of one of the great Puritans, at this time was teaching, for the first time, he was teaching black slaves in New England that they were enslaved because they were sinners. So again, this is American theology expressing American mythology, which is expressing what has now become the American psyche or the psychology. So it's all connected and it's all expressing in history. So these are the 5 things that were happening in this 20-year period. By the end of this 20-year period, the American mythological narrative and the thinking and the concepts behind it are pretty much solidly solidified. And to a great extent, for the next 300 years, we have regular repetition of this story in history. in 100 different examples. Part of what's happening here also at the same time is this growing notion of the American dream. Now that's a figure, an image that, or a phrase that doesn't enter until the 1930s, but it's obviously referring to something that Americans have been telling ourselves about ourselves for quite a long time before that. And again, so what's the idea of the American dream? That you can have whatever you want. If you work hard enough at it, you'll get it, and you can get anything you want. You can become anything you want to be. I would suggest stopping a second and pondering that notion. Indigenous culture says the exact opposite. Indigenous culture across the world says you were born to be one thing. And the whole point of initiation, the whole point of enculturation and socialization is to get you to realize what that one thing is and contribute it to our culture. American mythology turned that completely around and said, you're a blank slate. You're a, what's the phrase? What's that Latin phrase?
Tabula rasa.
Tabula rasa, yeah. That you're a blank slate and you've come into the world with no history whatsoever. Of course, below that is this notion of predestination, but that's in the unconscious. The conscious story, so to speak, the superficial story, is the American dream. You work hard enough and you can have it, you can get whatever you want. And of course, the corollary of that is if you don't get whatever you want, it's what? It's your own fault. Exactly. So it's a theological notion that's intertwined with these mythological narratives and this psyche that's growing now over, I don't know, 20 generations of Americans. So what does this American dream tell you? It tells you you work hard, you'll have the dream in this life, and then you'll go to heaven. In other words, you can have it in both worlds. You can have success in both worlds. So I think that's one reason why this notion of the American dream has been so attractive, not just to Americans, but to people all across the world. It's this notion of self-improvement and progress and opportunity and optimism. These are some of the catchphrases that really do distinguish us when Europeans or Asians or Africans, South Americans speak about America. These are the phrases that pop into their minds because they've been hearing about it in all of their popular culture for generations and generations. America is the land where you can come and have it all. Consequently, and again, we always have the shadow of this that's coming along with it. Political historians have wondered for many generations now, for example, why did not a very strong socialist, let alone communist, working class movement, a permanent one, arise in America? It arose in every European country and pretty much everywhere across the world, the third world. Only in America we not have a mass workers' movement. Well, John Steinbeck answered that. He says, socialism never took root in America because the poor see themselves not as an exploited proletariat, but as temporarily embarrassed millionaires. Now things are changing, of course, as in the last couple of generations have begun to change. But as recently as 1990, I think it was, a survey that I make reference to in the book asked questions using a terminology that most Americans weren't even using now, but that is on everybody's mind now. That it's the 1%. In 1990, 19% of Americans thought that they were in the 1%. And a second 19% believed that they eventually would be in the 1%. So roughly 2/5 of Americans, use the word delusion if you like. I'm talking story. They were fully inhabiting, because it's part of who we are. I mean, I shouldn't even use the word they. It's part of who we are. It's a story we tell ourselves. We think that we're going to be part of the 1%, if we're not already. Even now, I mean, I'm sure those numbers aren't quite as stark 25 years down the line, but I'm sure it's, if such polls were taken using similar kinds of questions, they would still stun us with the degree of, delusion. But this is essential American mythology. And always, I have to keep coming back, every mythology, or at least our mythology, has a deep shadow because we are so unwilling or unable to pay attention to it. The shadow is that if we're not in the 1%, it's our own fault. So I really haven't had time to get into foreign policy kinds of issues, but I think I can say in simple terms, I have made reference, this notion of manifest destiny. It's interesting. Historians commonly, when they speak of American imperial designs, conventional historians refer to the year 1898, when America began to have imperial designs. More nuanced historians have made lists of the 100 places where America intervened in other nations' history before 1898. And of course, we're only even that kind of to constrict the conversation even to those terms is to avoid the broader question of what Americans, even before they were calling themselves Americans, when they were still calling themselves English, what the hell they were doing on this continent in the first place, and what liberties they took wherever they could to steal the land from the Native Americans. Thomas Jefferson used the phrase "empire for liberty" 40 years before they were people used the phrase "manifest destiny." That America, of course, America was an empire, but it was an empire in which we were spreading liberty wherever we went. Of course, he wasn't consulting with the Native Americans. But the point is, America, even before we have a notion of America, it's the spreading across, and going back to things I said earlier, this empty land. There was always this notion of an empty land. And I'll put another piece onto that. Obviously, there were plenty of natives there, and far more natives than people realized. Even up until maybe 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the consensus was that maybe there were 3 or 4 million Native Americans. Now the consensus is that if you include the entire Western Hemisphere, there were 150 million people. But it was empty land. Why was it empty land? Because they were not utilizing the land. They were not, they were holding the land in common. They were the original Red Communists, of course. But I mean, this was the line of thinking in 1620, 1650, 1700. The land was empty because it was not being utilized. So that this was the genesis of the American Empire, and we don't have time to get into contemporary political issues much.
Can you say something about bacon and that nature's there to be raped? Is that something you know about?
Well, that's actually Sir Walter Raleigh,
Okay.
who's making that statement. He said Guyana still has her maidenhead. I mean, he's literally making the connection. Yeah, it's not well, Bacon, in Bacon's rebellion, the black indentured servants were united temporarily with the white ones.
I was thinking Francis Bacon, yeah, but.
Francis Bacon,
With,
the,
did he pick up that thing about the nature?
I don't
use
know.
it? Yeah.
I don't know.
What was the guy at Raleigh, you say?
Yes,
Oh,
but I mean, he's just expressing common
at that point.
understandings.
Yeah.
Yeah. This land is empty, and it's just,
God ordained to take it, is what I would.
yeah. Not that he was religious, but, you know, he's speaking within a religious culture, or a culture that's utilizing religion to justify imperial conquest, if you will.
Yeah.
But just in terms of our lifetimes, America has bombed, depending on which authorities you refer to, somewhere between 45 and 50 sovereign nations, just since the end of World War II. And in every single one of those stories, or the story has been, A, they provoked it, and B, we're doing it for their own good. Famous phrase comes out of Vietnam: we had to destroy the village in order to save it. And that phrase itself refers to a similar statement that was made back in the Renaissance. But I mean, we could go on and on. But I'll tell you what, I'll wrap this up at 9 because that's what I need to do. And if we want to keep on talking, I'm happy to hang around. But I do want to include a bit of a notion here that is very critical as well. From one person's perspective, it's very easy to suggest that I've been sitting here for 2 hours just attacking and criticizing America. Again, I'm trying to talk about what the story is, but it's important. How do we put this? A story wouldn't hold us so strongly, so intensely, so permanently, if it didn't have archetypal dimensions, which is to say, if it didn't have some opening into the deeper levels of a real functioning mythology, which is to say, imagination of the potential of life. I would, throughout the third world, people are perfectly aware of the destruction and the misery wrought by the American armed forces and the American Empire. At the same time, there is no place in the world where large numbers of the people, if given a chance, wouldn't come to live here. What's that all about? To me, what that is saying is, telling us, is that the myth of America is so strong, which is to say the myth of potential and optimism and a dream that for whatever reason can't be realized back home, is so compelling. And it's not simply about the money, about making money. To me, that's the most superficial aspect of the whole thing. What it's really about is, and this is a place where we can end the formal conversation, what it's really about is that if we cook down the myth of American innocence down to its nugget of meaning, it's actually expressing the most fundamental mythic notion of all, which is the myth or the story of new birth. That aside, and what the money suggests is something much deeper, the notion that we could make money by coming to America. What it's, the real essential mythic message of of the story is that this is a place where the whole world, for several hundred years now, has identified as the place to come and drop the past and come and start all over again and have a new beginning. And that's the essence of initiation. That's the essence of it's the most essential mythic notion of all. The possibility that there was always the possibility of new birth. Of course, what indigenous mythologies understand is that there is no birth without death. And the American story says that you don't have to die in order to be reborn. And so there's a few problems there. But still, cook that down further, and it's about rebirth. So, and I think that's why people have always been and will continue to be fascinated with the possibility of who these deluded crazy Americans are. And why, and on the one hand, why we've been screwing it up so badly, but on the other hand, to turn the question around slightly, why haven't we embodied the story more? And the story is telling us, I think, that the answer is right there with the original question. It's there. It can happen, not without pain and grief and loss, but it can happen. So I don't have a lot of optimism on the political scene that I can convey, but my imagination is that the story is going to have to be followed to the end, and the end may very well mean great universal suffering, but that eventually something may arise, maybe not in our lifetimes, that will express this new birth. And I don't have a whole lot of solid argument. This is about, to back that up, this is about my imagination, but I know what the mythology is telling us. And that itself is a source of some kind of hope. And so I have to say that to balance all of this negative shit I've been saying. So I'll tell a little poem just to close, and then if you want to hang out, we'll hang out some more. This is Denise Levertov. It's called Candles in Babylon. Through the midnight streets of Babylon, between the steel towers of their arsenals, between the torture castles with no windows, we race by barefoot, holding tight our candles, trying to shield the shivering flame, crying, sleepers awake, hoping the rhyme's promise was true, that we might return from this place of terror, home to a calm dawn and the work we had just begun. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
And I really hope I've pissed you off in some